Chapter 6. Homecoming. Time seemed to move slowly in this place, in the midst of the world, yet move on it did. Abram passed the count of 20 years, and soon attained the age of 30. Yet the ancients, Heber, Shem, and father Noah, changed very little. Even as 30 left and Abram became 40, he felt as though he lived in a part of the world cut off from time. Over and over, throughout the years, the tale of mankind and his relationship with the Eternal was told and retold to Abram. He committed it to his memory, in the hopes that one day he would be allowed to leave the house of Noah, return home, and share this good news with his family. That at least was Abram's secret desire. For as the years went by, the stories were told and retold here in the wild, beautiful wilderness, between the walls of heaven, where the ark could still be seen, and its many anchor stones dotted the Valley of the Eight. This was not like the idols that his mother worshipped, tiny things that could be broken by a careless child. Nor were they temporary things like the sun and the moon, celestial bodies that rose and set, waxed and waned, one giving way to another. The Eternal was bigger than clay statues or the burning bodies of the heavens, and his handiwork could be seen everywhere. More than simply the ark and its relics, but in the wilds where Abram lived and herded the sheep of the pasture of Noah. So the years carried on. Abram's beard grew long, and in time the dark luster of his hair took on a hoary frost. As he was one of the children, as Noah called them, he would age much faster than the ancients. But there was yet enough of their blood within his veins that he did not become a dotard yet. From his hard work leading the flocks in the field, his muscles had plenty of use in exercise, and so atrophy was hardly a concern for him. In fact, he was in such excellent health and fitness of body that, at the age of 50, he was not much slower than he had been at the age of 40. At last, a day came when Noah called Abram into the yard of the house. He found the old man leaning upon his staff, looking at the standing stone where his wife lay, mouldering in the ground beneath his feet. The salt and pepper-haired Abram reverently approached the old man, knowing precisely how much this sight meant to him. "You sent for me, father?" Abram asked. "Yes, my son," Noah said. He turned about to face Abram. The boy that had come here 40 years ago was now a man, at least as the children understood manhood. Nonetheless, Noah did not disparage Abram for his youth. In fact, there was a hint of pride in his eyes as he looked at the man standing before him. "For 40 years you have kept my flocks and tended my herds, Abram," Noah began. "And all this time I have taught you all that I know about the Eternal, our God. There is no more to teach you. Now, you must go out into the world and teach the children to remember their God. I failed to do this, bound as I am to this garden." He gestured to the house with one hand, that came to rest upon his thigh as he brought it back down. "And neither were Shem and Heber possessing the courage to do this. But perhaps you, my son, can succeed where others have failed." "How can I succeed where others have failed, father?" Abram asked. "By faith, my son," Noah replied. "Now then, I'm sure you will give your formal goodbye to the rest of the family. They'll certainly miss you. You've been a great help to us all. You and your children are welcome to this house of learning." "But I have no children," Abram stated. "You will, my son," Noah said with a wink. "I doubt not that you will have other things to do while you are away, apart from teaching the children about the Eternal." At this he sighed. "What's wrong, father?" "I am old," Noah replied. "Not as old as my grandfather was when he died, I know. But I don't know if I shall live as long as he did." He frowned. "Something in the air after the flood, it's not as rich and wholesome as it was back then. Perhaps I shall be the last son of Adam to attain 900 years. In any case," he turned to Abram, whose dark eyes were welling with tears. "In any case, I fear that I shall not see you again. I should give you a parting gift, a passing down of something valuable from the older generation to the younger one. I have not the skins, unfortunately. When I was drunk and uncovered myself, my son Ham stole the skins from my keeping. As far as I know from Heber, he gave it to his grandson, Nimrod, the king of Ur. You will do well to be wary of him, my son, for he is mighty upon the earth. No greater hunter has lived upon the earth. Noah sighed and looked at the staff in his hand. This staff was plucked from a tree of the Garden of Eden by the eternal God, and given to Adam as a digging stick with which he tilled the ground. In the days of Canaan, Enoch, and Methuselah, it was the scepter of a prince. May it now go with you in all of your wanderings, that you may remember the eternal your God, and the house of Noah, and all that you have learned. Noah held out the staff in his gnarled, aged hands. Abram took it in his hands, not as old and gnarled as the hands of Father Noah, but showing the gentle creases of age nonetheless. When at last the day came for Abram to head south and west, back into the land of his father, he made it known to everyone in the house that he would be leaving. It was a sorrowful delegation that bid farewell to the son of Terah. He had been a valuable help to the house, and they had treated him with kindness and love. Before he departed, the few women that dwelt there gave him supplies for the road ahead: flatbread, dried nuts, cheese made from goat's milk, and water. They also gave him a cloak made of wool that would keep him warm and serve as a blanket during the cold nights before him. Of the great ones of the house, Noah had already said his piece, and had given Abram a gift befitting the task ahead of him. He now sat upon the stone retaining wall, with two others beside him to lead him to and fro as he wished. Shem repeated what his father Noah had told him, that he and his were always welcome to return to this house whenever they wished, especially for instruction. Heber, however, had a few more words for his descendant. I will tell you how to return to the land of Terah, Heber began. When you leave this place, travel southwest until you come to the Sea of Van. There you will find others who speak our language. Ask them, and they will set you on the road to Ur-Chaldim. There are many cities in the south by the name of Ur, but your father Terah dwelleth in Ur-Chaldim. He embraced Abram and kissed him once on each cheek. The eternal God be with you, Abram. At last, with many tears watering his beard, Abram bade farewell to the house of Noah, and set his sandals to the long and dusty path leading out of the Valley of the Eight. The journey south on foot would not be an easy one. Leagues upon leagues stood between the house of Noah and Ur-Chaldim, the end of his journey. Even the trek to the Sea of Van would be no small feat. Yet he had spent many years in this country, and knew the stones and the trees by name. He knew where to find water, and which wild food was good for eating. Moreover, he could defend himself against any wild beasts he encountered, and, with a little more effort, roast their meat upon a small fire to eat in order to sustain himself. He was neither ignorant nor helpless, and met the challenge of the wilderness with bravery and courage with every league southwestward he went. In this land, time meant very little to him. Day was the time of travel, and night was the time of watchful rest. Whether in caves or secluded hollows in the earth, he went on his journey, encountering little else besides the animals and the elements. By morning of the second day of his travel, he had arrived on the shores of the Sea of Van. It didn't take him too long from there to find others who spoke a language he could understand, who would direct him the rest of the way. The remainder of the journey before him would take most of a month and a half, traversing land that was becoming less of a remote steppe of freezing nights and dry, cool days, and gradually becoming milder and warmer the farther south he went. By and by, the mountains began to recede into wide, flat lands that were drier and more arid than the steppes surrounding the Valley of the Eight. The long, hot days and cold nights were no picnic, and sometimes he found no better place to sleep than on the bare earth with nothing more than a stone for a pillow. At last, one morning after many long days and weeks of travel, while Abram was about his journey, he espied in the distance a titanic structure on the horizon. He hadn't seen it at the beginning of his journey, for it was so far away, and there had been mountains in his way. but at last he could see it, and he guessed that this was the place he had been told of. For there was another story that he had heard from Heber in the many years of his stay in the house of Noah. The story that Nimrod built a great tower for himself and his people. There were various rumors as to why it was built, whether as surety in the event of another deluge, or to ascend to the heavens and exalt the ancient kings above the stars of the eternal God, or whether to make war upon the Eternal himself. But the effect was the same. This tower was a symbol of defiance against the eternal God. Every day afterward, he kept that tower in his eyes. It served to him as the North Star did in the sky for a guide. He knew where to go, and would not be lost now. Days continued, but still he followed the far-off sight of the tower. The arid land about him became dotted here and there with smaller villages, while clear signs of life and civilization began to appear. Roads that were clearer than a mere goat path started to be seen. And by, Abram found himself walking along the largest of these roads. But it did not lead him towards the tower. Instead, it led him towards the walls of a very large city, towards which many groups of travelers on foot or on camels, donkeys, or horses wound their paths. From the catches of words between those around him who could speak his language, Abram learned that he was on the right path. That great city towards which the road led was Ur-Chaldim, the Ur of the Chaldees. No one in that great city paid much attention to the stranger from the desert who entered the city by the main gates. Ever and anon, he would ask of those he met where Terah might be found. These directed him by way of pointing and telling him which way to go, and how he would see the house, where it could be found. For this he thanked them, and gave the blessing of the Eternal upon them, to which they looked oddly at him, but went their way. By and by he found the place, a palatial estate with a large courtyard and many palm trees within the gardens. Abram looked upon this house in marvel. The stone house of Noah, in which he had spent most of his years, was small and simple, but it was enough for him to live and be sheltered from the elements in. Who could possibly need such a large house? When he came to the entrance of the house, armed guards met him. Politely, Abram told them his name, and asked that they tell Terah that his son Abram was here to see him. They looked upon him with disbelief, yet he refused to leave the door of the house no matter what threats they made. A whole day passed, and Abram slept just by the doorstep outside of the house, but still did not move. By the morrow, when the guards saw that he hadn't left, they essayed to throw him out, yet once again he made his plea to see Terah. As luck would have it, the steward of the house was nearby, and overheard the commotion. Coming down to the entrance of the courtyard, and seeing the ordeal, he commanded the servants to stop, and approached the strange man in weather-beaten clothing. "Do you want charity, man?" the steward said. "My master is rich. He will surely give you something. But when you have received it, be gone and trouble us no more." "I ask no charity of any man, sir," Abram returned. "I am a servant of the eternal God, and he will sustain me, as he has on my journey. I only ask to see the lord of this house, Terah the son of Nahor." "You and everyone else," the servant replied. "My master is a busy man. He doesn't have time for the likes of you." "But I am his son, Abram," Abram replied. "Please, call up my lord father to see me. He will know the truth of this matter. Let me, I pray you, see my lord father and speak to him, for I have stayed here in the streets all night waiting to look upon my lord father." The steward hesitated upon hearing this. He did not quite believe what this strange, bedraggled old man was saying, but he knew that his master would not approve of him leaving him out on the streets if he was indeed his son. So the steward told Abram to wait and leave not, while he went back into the house and sought out Terah. He found him in the garden, relaxing with Amthalo, and told him that an old man had come in from off the desert, brought here by the eternal God, and was claiming that he was Terah's son Abram. These made no hesitation, but ordered the steward to take them to him immediately. They left the garden and came to the courtyard, where they saw the old man waiting for them. "This is the man, my lord," said the steward. Terah ordered the guards to stand down, which they promptly did. "Come here, sir," Terah said to Abram. "Let us look upon you." Abram slowly approached the man. He had never seen his father's face in waking memory. Of a truth, he had dreamed what his father might look like in the many long years in exile in the house of Noah. Yet what stood before him was a bald old man, slightly shorter than him, clean of face, and not quite as lean or sturdy as he had envisioned him. Perhaps he had the intellect that made him the captain of King Nimrod's armies, or maybe life in luxury had softened him. As Abram approached him, he spoke slowly and hesitantly. "Are you Terah, son of Nahor?" "I am," Terah replied. "And this is my wife, Amphel." But there was no doubt in the mind of Abram when his eyes fell upon his mother. Her face he had known for 10 years of his life, the time before the house of Noah. Though she was old and many lines of care filled her face, there could be no doubting that this was the same woman who had given him life and love and reared him in the cave in the wilderness. Tears filled her dark eyes as she looked upon the likeness of her son, now grown to manhood. All trace of boyishness was gone, and only his dark eyes remained the same in all those years. She reached up with one hand and caressed his cheek. "My son," Amthala wept quietly. "Mother," Abram replied, his voice heavy with emotion. She threw her arms about him and buried her face in his chest, weeping heavily for joy at seeing him once again. As soon as she had removed herself from him, only for a moment, Abram turned to Terah and knelt before him. "My lord father." "Abram, my son," Terah said, and took his son's head in his arms, holding him close to his bosom while his eyes were filling with tears. So it was that Abram had left behind one family and been reunited with another. A feast was announced almost as soon as Terah could catch his breath, celebrating that his son had returned to him. The best room in the house, an upper room with a view of the city and the gardens, was prepared for them. The cooks were worked overtime to prepare food and drink for their guests, while other servants appeared and washed from Abram's feet the dust of his journeys. Others combed his long, gray-black hair and beard, and clothed him in fine clothes of silk. His new garments consisted of a cloak, designating his elevated state, a new pair of sandals, and a silken skirt that went just past his knees. Yet, despite his protests, he would not surrender his staff, but carried it with him into the upper room. In the upper room, he found Terah and Amthala waiting to greet him. Behind them were 2 men, both of them with black-gray hair, neatly trimmed and curled beards, and dressed similarly to how he himself was now dressed. In addition, both of these men had black coal painted around their eyes, which made their dark eyes pop out and made Abram recognize that their eyes were similar in color to his own, almost to a T. "Abram, my son," Terah said, "these are your brothers." He gestured to the oldest, who bore a cloak trimmed with gold. "This is my firstborn, Haran, your elder brother. And this is your younger brother, Nahor, named after my father." He gestured to the other man. His beard and hair were less gray than either Abram or Haran's. At Terah's command, they each embraced Abram and, placing one hand upon the shoulder, gave words of welcome to their long-lost brother. "Welcome, little brother," Haran said to Abram, a hint of strain in his voice. "My brother," Nahor said warmly. "Haran, is your son here?" "Soon, my lord. You know how he is. Tarries until the last minute." In a short time another man arrived in the room. If one could call it an arrival, rather than being announced, he had to be dragged into the upper room by a rather flustered-looking steward, who seemed quite fed up with having to drag him into the company. Abram saw that this man, while also bearded and looking very similar to Haran, was much younger. There was no gray in his hair, but the full vibrance and richness of the dark color of all of their hair. "There he is, little brother. Allow me to introduce you to my son and heir, Lot. Greetings, Lot, son of my brother." "My lord uncle," Lot greeted, bowing reverently to Abram. "I have heard tell of you. though I have never in all my days expected to see you here, in our house, in the living flesh. Abram, however, was looking about the room, the nervous posturing of Lot quite forgotten. He happened to notice something in the center of the room, a silken canopy draped down from the ceiling, beneath which was a cushioned couch. Surely this must be for some great and noble person to sit. As he looked thither, his eyes happened upon two figures reclining upon said couch. It was the first time that Abram had seen up close young women, for the women of the house of Noah were old and dressed conservatively. These two were both dressed in silken gowns, whose skirts extended down to their feet. The gowns reached up and wrapped around the left shoulder, leaving exposed the right shoulder and bosom. Of the two women, one of them immediately caught Abram's eye. She was taller than the other, and seemed statelier and grander. The way she moved seemed to captivate Abram's eye, each motion slender and graceful. All other thoughts fled from his mind as he viewed her, the grand lady. "Ah, my brother," Haran said, "I see you've noticed my daughters. The eldest was born 10 years after you were. Her name is Sarai. The younger is my younger daughter Melka." But Abram wasn't paying attention to his older brother, so enraptured he was with the beautiful Sarai. Then, in one infinitesimally small moment, Sarai's dark eyes met his own. All thought and memory faded from his mind the moment their eyes met. A smile appeared across Sarai's lips, and Abram was stunned in silence, unable to speak or close his mouth. Only when his nephew Lot gave him a nudge on the shoulder did Abram return to his senses. The story continues in Chapter 7.